There comes a moment when your soul knows something must change. Not later, not eventually. Now. It's not a loud alarm, but an ache deep inside. A whisper that says, I can't keep going like this. Maybe you've felt it. That quiet desperation while folding laundry, driving alone, or staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night. You've held it in, pushed through, smiled when you didn't feel like it. But something inside you is crying out for more. Not more effort, not more answers, more of God. This is not just another video. This is a call, a divine interruption. A moment carved out in time where heaven leans close and your heart, weary as it may be, begins to listen differently. Because when life weighs heavy, when prayers feel unanswered, when silence grows loud, that's often when God is drawing nearest. And if you're here, it's not by accident. You're being called, urgently, tenderly, into a deeper trust. You may feel tired. You may feel like you've prayed and waited and believed, and still nothing has shifted. But friend, I need you to hear this. God is not late. He is not ignoring you. And what feels like delay may be divine preparation. But this moment, this is holy. Because the pain you're carrying is not too small for Him. The questions you've buried are not shameful to Him. You don't have to have perfect faith to be met by perfect love. So take a breath, a real one. Let your soul settle for just a moment. Because in the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 15 spiritual keys. Each one a lifeline. Each one a sacred invitation. These keys are not theories. They're tools. Gifts from heaven for real people with real pain. People like you and me. And as we open each one, I believe something will begin to shift. Not just around you, but within you. And as we reach the final key, we'll go even deeper, into prayer. Not a scripted one, but a sacred moment of encounter. A time where everything else fades and your spirit meets His. Where healing can begin, where clarity can come, where burdens can finally be released. I believe that moment is coming, but for now, I ask you to walk with me. Stay close. Because the final key might be the one that unlocks what has been closed in your life for far too long. So here's what I invite you to do. Write this in the comments right now, as an act of surrender and faith. Even in silence, I trust God's hand. That's not just a sentence, it's a declaration. And sometimes one honest line is more powerful than 1,000 perfect prayers. If you've been looking for a sign, this is it. If your soul has been pacing in circles, this is the pause. If your spirit has been gasping for breath, this is the inhale. And if this place feels safe, if these words are waking something in you, I invite you to subscribe, to join this journey. Not because you need more content, but because your faith needs companionship. Because here, you're not just watching, you're walking a road, one that leads to restoration. So stay, not just to listen, but to receive. The key you need might be in the very next breath. And the first one we'll open together. It's about release, about unclenching what fear made you hold, about remembering that faith was never meant to be forced. It was meant to flow. But before we begin, I want to ask you this. What would happen if today you finally let go? Let's find out together, starting now. Key 1. Letting go is the first act of faith. It begins with clenched hands. Not literally. Sometimes we don't even notice it. But deep within, we're holding so tightly to what we fear to lose. Control, certainty, a timeline, a person, a plan. And the longer we hold it, the heavier it becomes. Maybe that's where you are right now. Exhausted not by what you've lost, but by how hard you're trying not to lose control. You keep whispering to yourself, just hold on. But what if the real miracle begins when you do the opposite? Letting go feels terrifying. It feels like weakness, like surrendering means losing. But in God's kingdom, surrender is not the end. It's the entry point. It's where you stop trying to force what only grace can finish, and where your soul finally exhales after holding its breath for too long. I want you to picture this with me. A woman standing in her kitchen, staring at the bills stacked on the table. Her coffee has gone cold. Her phone keeps lighting up, but she can't answer. Because what's weighing her down isn't just money. It's the fear of what happens if she can't hold it all together. Her child sleeps in the other room. Her faith feels worn thin, but somehow she whispers, "God, I can't." But you can. That whisper, that's where everything shifts. There is a sacred power in that sentence. It's the first key. Letting go is the first act of faith, not because it solves everything, but because it makes space for God to move. Until you release it, He won't take it from your hands. But the moment you surrender it, truly surrender, it no longer owns you. It no longer defines your peace. Jesus knew this deeply. In the Garden of Gethsemane, with the weight of the cross already pressing upon him, he prayed a prayer that echoed through eternity. "Not my will, but yours be done." Do you realize what that means? Even the Son of God had to let go. Even he faced the tension between fear and trust, between what he wanted and what the Father willed. And it was in that moment of surrender, not on the cross, but in the garden, that the victory began. So maybe today isn't about solving everything. Maybe it's about letting go of what you thought you had to carry. Maybe it's whispering like Jesus did, "Not my will." Maybe it's opening your hands, spiritually, emotionally, and letting what you're gripping fall into God's care. But I know, it's not easy, especially when the thing you're holding feels like survival, when it's all you have left. That dream, that relationship, that identity. And yet, friend, hear me gently. If it's costing you your peace, it's already too expensive to carry alone. Letting go is not giving up. It's giving over. It's trusting that the one who formed your days before you ever lived them knows exactly what he's doing. It's choosing to believe that his hands are safer than yours ever could be, that his timing, however mysterious, is not just divine, but deliberate. Maybe this is your Gethsemane moment, not with a crowd watching, not on a stage, but in the quiet space where only God sees. Maybe you're not meant to win the battle by fighting harder. Maybe you're meant to win by falling into his arms, finally. I want to ask you something, and answer it with your heart. What are you still holding on to? What keeps you awake at night? What have you prayed about, but never actually released? Could it be that the weight you feel is not the enemy, but your own resistance? Even now, God is near, not to scold, not to rush, but to receive what you can no longer carry. You're not alone. Thousands of others are standing on the same holy edge, ready to release, ready to rise. If you're feeling that nudge, that warmth, that whisper, it's him. He's inviting you to let go. And if you feel this key pressing into your spirit, you're not alone. This is where so many hearts begin to breathe again. Stay here. Let it sink in. And when you're ready, write this in the comments, not just for you, but as a witness to others walking the same path. Today, I let go and I trust him. The journey doesn't end here. This is just the release. And when you finally let go, something else begins to rise. Hope. But there's more to this path than surrender. Because after the release comes the silence. And in that silence, God speaks. So stay close. Because in the next key, we'll explore what it means to trust God when nothing makes sense yet. When answers don't come, but peace still can. Key 2, trusting God. When the silence feels endless. There's a kind of silence that doesn't soothe. It stings. It arrives after you've prayed all you can, cried all you had, and waited longer than you ever thought you could. You begin to wonder if heaven has gone quiet, if your words fell into some spiritual void. You still believe. You still hope. But beneath that hope is a whisper you don't want to admit. What if nothing changes? You check your phone, hoping for a message. You open your Bible, asking for a word. You lay awake at night, listening for something, anything. But all you hear is your own breathing, and maybe the ticking of a clock that seems to mock your patience. This is not the silence of peace. It's the silence of unanswered questions. The silence that grows louder the longer it lingers. And yet, this silence may be holy ground. Because what if silence isn't the absence of God, but the way he clears the noise so you can hear him in a new way? This is the second key. Trusting God when the silence feels endless. Not when he speaks, not when he acts, but when he seems still, so still that you begin to doubt your own faith. This kind of trust is not easy. It's not loud. It doesn't always feel strong. Sometimes it looks like sitting on the edge of your bed with tear-stained cheeks, whispering, "I still believe you're good." Let me take you back to a moment in Scripture, John 11. Lazarus is sick. His sisters, Mary and Martha, send word to Jesus. They don't ask him to come. They trust that just knowing will be enough. But then, nothing. Jesus waits 2 more days. He delays. Not because he doesn't love them, but because he does. And when he finally arrives, Lazarus is dead, buried, wrapped, gone. Imagine what that silence felt like for them. They had seen him heal others. They believed in his power. But when it was their turn, he didn't come on time. At least, not on their time. And still, when Martha hears Jesus is near, she runs to him. And her first words, not praise, not anger, but a confession full of both sorrow and trust. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now," those 2 words, "but even now," are everything. They are trust in its rawest form. Trust that lives beyond explanation. Trust that still reaches when it doesn't understand. Maybe that's the place you're in today. Maybe you've been waiting for something to shift, for an answer, a door, a word, and all you've found is quiet. But what if the silence isn't your punishment, but your preparation? What if what feels like absence is actually God's way of softening your heart, so he can fill it with something new? There's something sacred that happens in the waiting. We stop trying to force answers. We stop leaning on emotions, and our faith is stripped down to its bones, bare, but real. It's in that space where trust becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a choice, a daily, sometimes hourly choice to say, "God, I don't see it, I don't feel it, but I know you." And that's enough for now. Maybe you haven't heard him lately, but you're still here. That means something. It means you haven't given up. It means your faith has roots deeper than your feelings. It means you're growing in the dark, where no one sees but God. So let this be your confession today. Even in silence, I choose to trust you. Say it out loud if you can, or write it in the comments. Those words carry power. They echo in places your fear cannot reach. They are not the sign of weakness, but of maturity. Because anyone can trust when the skies are clear. But to trust in the fog, that's faith. This channel, this space, is for hearts like yours. For souls that know what it's like to wait and still believe. You're not alone. And I believe the silence you've been walking through is not empty. It's pregnant with purpose. So hold on. Not to the outcome, but to the one who holds you. Keep walking, even when the path is dim. Keep whispering prayers, even if they sound like questions. And stay close, because the silence will not last forever. Resurrection always comes. But first, there is a tomb. And God often moves in stillness before he moves in sight. As you sit with this truth, feel free to rest here. Re-listen, re-breathe. And if this has reached you, share it. Someone else may be waiting in the same silence. But now, I want to invite you deeper. Because if you've ever felt that your past disqualified you from hope, if you've ever wondered whether God could truly use someone like you, then the next key is for you. Stay with me. What's coming may heal the part of you you've tried hardest to hide. Key 3. Your past doesn't cancel God's purpose. Sometimes, the loudest voice isn't the one coming from outside. It's the one echoing inside your own soul. It says things like, "You should have known better. You've gone too far. God can forgive, but he won't use someone like you." You hear those words, not just in the quiet, but in the cracks of your everyday. When you pass a mirror, when you remember what you did, when you compare your story to someone else's. But I want to tell you something now, urgently and tenderly. That voice is not the voice of God. It's the voice of shame. And shame is a liar. You may have a past. We all do. Some of us wear it like a scar. Some bury it so deep we forget we're still bleeding from it. But the enemy wants you to believe that because of what happened, what you did or what was done to you, God has revoked his calling on your life. But he hasn't. He won't. Because God's purpose is not built on perfection, it's built on redemption. This is the third key. Your past doesn't cancel God's purpose. If anything, your past may be the very ground he wants to use to display his glory. Not despite your wounds, but through them. Take Paul, for example. Before he became the apostle who wrote much of the New Testament, he was Saul, a man who hunted Christians, approved their deaths, and tried to destroy the very church he would one day help build. If God can take the hands of a persecutor and turn them into hands that write Holy Scripture, what can he do with yours? But let's not stop there. Let's walk into John 4, where Jesus meets a woman at a well. She comes alone in the heat of the day because shame has made her hide from others. Her past is known. Her story is stained. She's been married 5 times, and the man she's with now isn't her husband. She doesn't expect kindness. She doesn't expect hope. But Jesus doesn't avoid her. He waits for her, and instead of judgment, he gives her the longest recorded one-on-one conversation he ever had. He offers her living water. Not after she fixes her life. Right there, in the mess, in the middle of her shame. And do you know what happens next? She becomes the first evangelist in her town. Her story, the same one that made her hide, is now the story that sets others free. Maybe that's the truth you need today. That the part of you you've tried hardest to hide might be the very part God wants to redeem publicly. Not to embarrass you, but to heal you. To show others that if he can restore you, he can restore anyone. You are not too broken. You are not too late. You are not too far. And even now, God is whispering your name. Not your mistake, not your regret. Your name. He still sees the purpose he placed in you before the beginning of time. That calling didn't get erased by a bad decision. It didn't expire with your failure. It's still there, waiting, glowing beneath the ashes. But here's what needs to happen. You have to stop agreeing with the lie. You have to stop rehearsing the guilt. You have to stop letting the voice of shame narrate your story. Today, you can choose a new voice, the voice that says, I am forgiven, I am called, I am still part of God's plan. Let that settle in. Say it out loud if you need to, or write it in the comments. Your words may unlock someone else's healing. This truth may seem whispered, but it carries the weight of a promise eternal. So stay with your heart open. There's more to be revealed. Because the next key will lead you into one of the most overlooked miracles in the life of faith. The strength that comes not when you fight, but when you rest. You've carried enough. You've run long enough. But what if the next breakthrough doesn't come through action, but stillness? Let's talk about that next. Key 4. Resting in God is also spiritual warfare. There comes a moment in every spiritual battle when your body is still moving, but your soul is already exhausted. You keep doing. You keep praying. You keep pushing. Not because you feel strong, but because you're afraid that if you stop, everything will fall apart. You think, if I rest, I'll lose the fight. If I pause, I'll fall behind. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most powerful move you can make right now isn't to fight harder, but to rest deeper? That's the 4th key. Resting in God is also spiritual warfare. It's not passivity. It's not giving up. It's choosing to believe, right in the thick of uncertainty, that God is still working when you stop striving. Rest is not weakness. It's worship. In Exodus 14:14, the Israelites stood on the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army thundered with fury. Before them, only water. And God, through Moses, says something that seems almost offensive in the face of danger. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Not act, not shout, not run. Be still. Can you imagine hearing that with chariots approaching? With fear pulsing through your chest? Stillness in the storm takes more courage than we think, because everything in us wants to act, wants to fix, wants to figure it out. But stillness says, God, I trust you more than I trust my solutions. Stillness isn't empty. It's charged with expectation. It's the soul's declaration that we are not the savior of our own stories. It's faith choosing to rest before the breakthrough comes. Some of the most powerful victories happen while we sleep. Look at Elijah. After confronting false prophets on Mount Carmel, after fire from heaven fell, he ran, exhausted, afraid, ready to die. And do you know what God did first? He didn't preach to him. He didn't correct him. He let him sleep. He sent an angel with food and told him, "Eat, for the journey is too much for you. God didn't rebuke Elijah's fatigue. He restored it, because even prophets grow tired. Even warriors need rest. And so do you. What if what you've called laziness is actually God pulling you into restoration? What if your low energy isn't failure, but a sacred signal? He's not asking you to push harder. He's asking you to fall back into his arms. I want you to picture this now. A soldier in battle, shield cracked, breath shallow, wounds fresh. But instead of charging ahead, he's called to lie down, not in defeat, but in trust. While he rests, heaven sends reinforcements. While he sleeps, heaven surrounds his camp. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been bleeding invisibly, fighting battles no one sees. Maybe the bravest thing you can do today is stop, lay it down, let God carry the part you keep trying to manage. Rest isn't inactivity. It's sacred trust in motion. It's saying, Lord, I believe you're fighting for me even when I'm too tired to move. So let today be holy. Cancel one obligation. Take one deep breath that goes all the way down. Step outside. Turn off the noise and let the silence become a sanctuary. And if this word is reaching you in the middle of your overwhelm, know this. It's not too late to rest. You are not too far gone. Your spirit can still be renewed. Just as the earth rests before harvest, your soul may be in preparation for something greater than you imagined. If while listening someone special came to mind, someone weary, someone burdened, maybe God is asking you to be the messenger. Share this word with love. It may be the invitation they've been secretly longing for, because the next key we will open together holds something that often gets lost in the chaos, the clarity to hear God's voice again. When the noise fades, when the spirit quiets, something beautiful happens. So rest now, then get ready, because next, we listen. Key 5. God's voice is clearer in stillness than in striving. There is a kind of noise that doesn't come from the outside. It's the sound of the soul running, rushing, trying, desperate to feel close to God, but always wondering if it's doing enough. You listen to sermons, you pray, you fast, you serve, and still, deep down, there's a question that won't let go. Why can't I hear him? Maybe that's where you are. Your life is filled with spiritual activity, but the connection still feels faint. You're searching, not for miracles, just for his voice, his whisper, his reassurance. But everything is loud. Your thoughts, your expectations, the disappointments you didn't know you were still carrying. You've been moving so fast, even your faith has become a form of striving. But here's the 5th key. God's voice is clearer in stillness than in striving. God isn't hiding. He isn't playing games. But he often waits until we stop performing and start resting. He speaks clearest, not when we shout, but when we surrender. Not when we run, but when we sit. Because stillness isn't just the absence of motion. It's the presence of attention. The prophet Elijah discovered this in 1 Kings 19. After fire and wind and earthquakes, he found himself hiding in a cave, spiritually spent. He longed for God to show up in power. He had seen God consume sacrifices with fire. He had seen heaven open. But now, silence. And then it happened. Not in the wind, not in the fire, not in the earthquake, but in a gentle whisper. The voice of God came when everything else had been stripped away. Stillness creates space for the whisper. And whispers aren't heard through effort. They're heard through intimacy. This is why rest is not a luxury for the spiritual life. It's a requirement. Because in your stillness, you stop trying to manage God. You stop looking for signs and start listening for presence. And when your soul gets quiet enough, you'll realize something stunning. He's been speaking all along. Maybe the problem isn't that God has gone silent. Maybe it's that we've stopped being still. In a world that equates worth with output, stillness feels like failure. But in the kingdom of God, stillness is faith in action. It's choosing to believe that you don't have to earn his voice. You simply have to make room for it. Think of Mary of Bethany sitting at the feet of Jesus. While others rushed, she listened. While others prepared, she paused. Jesus didn't just defend her choice, he blessed it. She has chosen what is better, he said. Not louder, not busier, better. And what if that's what God is calling you into now? A pause, a holy slowdown, a moment where the noise in your soul finally makes space for peace to speak. Maybe you don't need another plan. Maybe you just need to sit, not to be productive, not to feel something spectacular, but to return to the place where His voice becomes your breath again. And if this truth is speaking to something in you, if even now your heart feels like it's exhaling for the first time in days, pause with it. Sit with it. Let the stillness become sacred. Because sometimes, it's not what God says that changes us, but the way His presence feels when we finally stop long enough to notice He's near. Many times, what God is building in us only becomes visible little by little. Don't turn away now. There's more light ahead. In the next key, we'll explore how to keep walking with faith when the outcome is still invisible, when obedience feels costly, and you're not sure if it's even making a difference. But what if that very faith, the one that keeps showing up in the dark, is the kind of faith that pleases God the most? We'll talk about that next. Key 6. Faith is obedience without immediate evidence. There is a quiet kind of courage that rarely gets celebrated. It's not loud. It doesn't look like victory. It's the kind of faith that shows up when results don't. When you've done what God asked, but nothing seems to change. When you've stepped out in obedience, and all you got in return was silence. This is the kind of faith that breaks the heart open, not because it fails, but because it asks everything, and gives no proof right away. You've been there, haven't you? You obeyed, you forgave, you sowed seeds of kindness, you stayed quiet when you could have fought back, you trusted when you could have controlled. And now, it feels like no one noticed, like heaven hasn't moved. And yet, in that hidden place, where no applause follows and no lightning strikes, faith is being forged. That's the 6th key. Faith is obedience without immediate evidence. It's not about certainty. It's not about results. It's about knowing who gave the instruction, even when you can't yet see why. We're taught to measure success by outcomes, numbers, reactions, proof. But in the kingdom of God, the measurement is obedience. Did you do what He asked? Then you've already succeeded, even if the fruit hasn't bloomed yet. Hebrews 11 is a list of the faithful, giants of belief. But if you read closely, you'll find this sentence. These all died in faith, not having received the promises but having seen them from afar. They lived their whole lives trusting a God they couldn't always understand, a promise they couldn't yet touch. And still, they walked forward. Think of Noah. God told him to build a boat in the middle of dry land. No rain in sight, no clouds forming, just a word. And for 120 years, he obeyed, day after day, hammering, building, trusting that what God said would come, even if it didn't make sense. Can you imagine the mockery, the fatigue, the doubt? And yet, Noah kept building. Because when God gives you a word, the evidence comes second. Faith believes before it sees. That might be where you are right now, building in silence, walking in obedience that no one celebrates, loving someone who doesn't reciprocate, praying for a breakthrough that hasn't arrived. But I want to tell you this, with urgency and gentleness, you're not doing it in vain. Heaven sees. The seeds you've planted in tears will one day bloom in joy. The hours you've prayed in secret have not been wasted. The acts of love you've offered in quietness are being recorded in eternity. You don't need a sign to stay faithful. Your obedience is the sign. So keep walking, even when your steps feel small. Keep saying yes to God, even when why hasn't been answered. One day, what you've carried by faith will be revealed in glory. And maybe that moment won't come all at once, but in slow, unfolding light. So today, write this in the comments, not just as hope, but as holy defiance. Even when I see nothing, I will still obey. Escreva nos comentários uma palavra que represente sua fé hoje. Às vezes, uma única palavra carrega o poder de uma oração inteira. Let that be your worship. Let it be your strength. Because God is not measuring your faith by what you can explain, but by what you're willing to entrust to Him without knowing the outcome. And friend, the outcome is coming. It may not look like what you imagined. It may not come when you expected, but it will come. Because obedience always opens a door. Sometimes in your life, sometimes in the life of someone else, sometimes in places you'll never see with your eyes. So breathe, stay the course, and keep building. Because the next key will show you what to do when the waiting becomes painful, when time feels like a weight, and hope feels too fragile to carry. There is a way to wait that strengthens your soul instead of draining it. We'll go there next. Key 7. Waiting with God is not wasting time. There's a particular kind of ache that doesn't shout. It lingers quietly, like the ticking of a clock in a dim room. Steady, unrelenting. You've done everything you were asked to do. You've obeyed. You've prayed. You've trusted. And now, you wait, and wait, and wait. You see others moving forward, receiving answers, living the breakthroughs you've been fasting for. You celebrate them, but somewhere deep inside you wonder, did God forget about me? That's the pain no one sees, the silent ache of waiting. But let me say this, with urgency and tenderness, God does not waste time, and neither should you. That's the 7th key. Waiting with God is not wasting time. Every moment you spend in waiting with a surrendered heart is ground being cultivated, roots growing deeper. It may feel like delay, but in the hands of God, it is development. The world teaches us that waiting is a void, a failure to progress, a gap. But in the kingdom of heaven, waiting is where the soil breaks open so the seed can become a tree. Think of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, wrongly imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped. 13 years of silence. 13 years where his dreams looked like lies. But in every prison, God was preparing him. In every delay, character was being forged. And when the door finally opened, he wasn't just free, he was ready. Because he didn't just wait. He waited with God. The waiting became the training. What if your waiting isn't a punishment, but preparation? What if the silence isn't absence, but strategy? God is not idle. Even now, he is rearranging what you cannot see. Sometimes he's changing the outcome. Sometimes he's changing you. Because a blessing given too soon becomes a burden. But a blessing received in the right time becomes a mantle you're strong enough to carry. Waiting is not passive. It's one of the fiercest forms of faith. It says, God, I trust you enough to stand still. I believe you're doing more in this silence than I could do in my striving. I choose to be faithful even when nothing around me feels fruitful. There is a weight in waiting, but there is also glory. Isaiah 40:31 says it with piercing beauty. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles, not those who run ahead, not those who figure it out, those who wait. It's in the waiting that strength returns. Maybe you're in that space right now, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because God is doing something deep, something lasting, something holy. And when the waiting ends, and it will, you will not come out weaker. You will rise stronger, with vision, with authority, with a testimony that cannot be shaken. So I invite you now to say these words in your spirit, or write them in the comments if your heart is ready. I will wait with God, even when I don't see why. Cada passo que você dá nesta jornada está alinhando seu espírito com o céu. Continue. Há algo sendo destravado dentro de você. The wait will not last forever, but what is being built in you during it might. And when the time comes, and God says now, the doors will open that no man can shut, and you'll know with every part of your soul that it was worth it. In the next key, we'll uncover the truth behind the fear that often surfaces in waiting, how to face what you've been avoiding, and how to let faith rise where anxiety once ruled. Because faith isn't just about believing God for blessings, it's about trusting Him when fear tries to paralyze your future. We go there next. Key 8. Faith is stronger than fear. When you speak it out loud, fear has a voice. It doesn't shout. It whispers, quietly, relentlessly. It creeps in when you're alone, when the house is still, when no one is asking how you're really doing. It says, what if nothing changes? What if you're not enough? What if God doesn't show up this time? And here's the truth. The more you entertain that voice in silence, the louder it grows. Fear feeds on your silence. But faith Faith grows when it's spoken. That's the eighth key. Faith is stronger than fear when you speak it out loud. Not just when you believe it quietly, not just when you journal it, but when you say it, declare it, let it echo through your atmosphere. Because something breaks when you speak what you believe, even if your voice shakes. In Mark 5, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years touched the edge of Jesus' cloak. She believed in her heart that she would be healed, but it wasn't until Jesus called her forward and she spoke that everything shifted. "Daughter," he said, "your faith has made you well." Not your thoughts, not your feelings. Your faith, spoken, revealed, bold. We live in a world full of noise, and yet so often we stay silent about what matters most. We let fear narrate our days. We let anxiety preach louder than truth. But you have the authority to flip the script. Because God hasn't given you a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. You are not at the mercy of your emotions. You are not a prisoner of your doubts. But to break that cycle, you must speak. And maybe you're not ready to declare a whole sermon. Maybe it's just one sentence today, but say it. Let your home hear it. Let your heart hear it. Let the enemy hear it. Say it like this: I will not be ruled by fear. I belong to God. Even now, I believe He is working. What He promised, He will fulfill. There is a shift that happens when the words of your spirit become sound in the atmosphere. It's not just expression, it's warfare. Because the enemy knows this. As long as you're silent, fear stays safe. But when you open your mouth and declare truth, chains begin to break. Maybe you've been silent for too long. Maybe fear has occupied a seat it never paid for. Today, let's evict it. Not by force, but by faith. Open your lips. Let faith fill the room. Declare it now, or write it here, as a witness of your trust. God is greater than my fear. I choose to trust Him today. Se esta mensagem falou ao seu espírito, declare com fé nos comentários: Senhor, eu confio em Ti. Essas palavras podem se tornar o ponto de virada da sua história. You don't need perfect confidence. You just need honest confession. God honors the trembling voice that says, I still believe. And sometimes, it's in the act of saying it out loud that your spirit finally begins to believe it again. Let your home hear you say it. Let your heart hear it. Let heaven hear it. Because the next key will carry you deeper into what it means to find strength not just in faith, but in belonging. Because even the strongest faith grows weary in isolation. But where there is connection, love, and spiritual covering, there is resilience. Let's talk about it next. Key 9. You were never meant to fight alone. There's a heaviness that doesn't come from the battle itself, but from the silence you endure within it. You're fighting, you're believing, you're doing your best, but no one really sees the whole weight you carry. And when the lights go off and the world quiets down, a deeper ache begins to whisper, am I really in this alone? Maybe you've felt that. You scroll through messages but don't know who to call. You walk into church but still feel unseen. You worship with others, yet your heart feels disconnected. You're surrounded and still lonely. But hear this with all the gentleness and power your soul needs. You were never meant to fight alone, not spiritually, not emotionally, not in silence. That's the 9th key. God designed you for communion, not isolation. From the very beginning, when God created Adam, the first thing He said was not worship me or serve me. He said, it is not good for man to be alone. And that truth still echoes through the hearts of countless believers today. Because while your relationship with God is personal, your walk of faith was never meant to be private. Even Jesus didn't walk alone. He called disciples. He wept with friends. He invited others into His most vulnerable moments. Gethsemane, the upper room, the road to Emmaus. Why would we think we're stronger without community if the Son of God Himself chose not to walk alone? The enemy thrives in isolation. He speaks lies more convincingly when you're disconnected. He tells you you're too broken to belong, that no one would understand, that if people really knew your battles, they would walk away. But those are lies designed to keep you in spiritual hiding. Because there's healing in being seen. There's strength in sharing the struggle. There's breakthrough when two or more agree. Ecclesiastes 4:10 says it plainly. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. You weren't created to carry this alone. Maybe that's why your heart feels so tired, not just from the weight, but from carrying it in silence. But today, you can begin a new chapter. Find one person, send one message, join one circle of faith. And if you don't have that yet, start here, right now. This space is not just a video, it's an altar, a gathering, a quiet, growing community of faith. You belong here. You don't need to have it all together. You just need to come as you are. And if your heart feels that stirring, if it's time to stop hiding and start healing, say this with me. I am not alone. I was created for connection. God's presence doesn't shout, it touches. And what you're feeling right now may be more than emotion. It may be encounter. Let this be a holy interruption in your loneliness, a sacred invitation back into communion. And as we continue, the next key will guide you into something deeper still. How to trust God's timing, not just when it's delayed, but when it looks nothing like what you expected. Because sometimes God's calendar feels foreign, but it's there, hidden in His timing, that His wisdom unfolds. We go there next. Key 10. God's timing is not a denial, it's a divine design. There's a place in the journey where faith starts to tremble, not because you've stopped believing, but because time keeps passing, and nothing is happening. You still pray, you still hope, but every unanswered petition starts to feel like rejection. And somewhere between the promise and the fulfillment, the question starts to rise. Did I misunderstand God? But I want to speak this truth into your heart like a steady flame. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean God has said no. Delay is not denial, it's design. That's the 10th key. God's timing is not a denial, it's a divine design. And while His calendar may confuse you, His timing is always working in alignment with your purpose. God does not rush transformation. If He's taking longer than you expected, it's because He's building something deeper than you imagined. Think of Abraham and Sarah, told they would have a child. But the years stretched out. Decades. Their bodies aged. Their hope dimmed. And yet, Romans 4:20 says that Abraham did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith. Why? Because faith in God's promise is not tied to human schedules. Sarah didn't conceive because of perfect conditions. She conceived because it was God's appointed time. And God's appointed time is not always early, but it's never late. Sometimes we think if it hasn't happened by now, it won't happen at all. But what if the delay isn't about punishment but preparation? What if God is not only lining up circumstances, but fortifying your soul so that when the answer comes, you can carry it with strength and humility? A door opened too soon can become a trap. A promise received too early can become an idol. But a blessing given in God's time becomes legacy. Waiting hurts. But so does stepping into something before you're ready. Maybe what God is building in the background of your delay is you. Maybe His silence is actually space for growth, for depth, for surrender, for character that won't collapse under the weight of your calling. So instead of saying, "Why is this taking so long?" start asking, "What are you preparing me for, God?" He doesn't tease. He doesn't forget. He orchestrates. And what He's preparing for you is not just an answer. It's alignment. A moment where every piece falls into place in a way you couldn't have manufactured, even with all your effort. But trust is required. The kind of trust that says, even when I don't understand, I believe you're wise. Even when I can't see movement, I believe you're working. So today, I invite you to release your deadlines, to surrender your clock, to give God back the calendar you've been clinging to. Say it with me, or write it below as an offering of trust. God, I release my timeline and rest in your perfect timing. At the end of this journey, we will pray together. From now on, start preparing your interior, not with words, but with dedication. And as you prepare your heart for that moment, know this: there's a reason it hasn't happened yet. And when it finally does, you'll look back and say, Now I see why he waited. But before we reach that moment of prayer, there's another key we must open. It's one that helps you navigate life when it still feels messy, when faith is real, but emotions are raw, when you trust God, but you still feel broken. Let's talk about faith that survives the storm inside. We go there next. Key 11. God can handle your brokenness. Sometimes faith feels heavy, not because we don't believe in God, but because we don't believe He would still want us like this. Tired, fractured, ashamed of the pieces we've hidden, even from ourselves. You show up in faith, but there's a weight behind your worship. There's a tremble beneath your prayer. And deep down, the question remains, can God really love me when I'm this broken? But here's the 11th key, and I need you to hold it close. God can handle your brokenness. He's not repelled by your pain. He doesn't flinch at your flaws. He doesn't withdraw because you're inconsistent. He draws closer. Psalm 34:18 tells us, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Not the polished, not the perfect, the broken. You don't have to clean yourself up before coming to Him. You just have to come. Because what you see as too shattered, He sees as sacred material. He's the God who picks up pieces, not to discard them, but to redeem them. Think of the woman with the alabaster jar. She came into a room full of men who judged her, labeled her, dismissed her. But she didn't offer words. She offered tears. She didn't have eloquence. She had perfume. She didn't have dignity. She had desperation. And Jesus? He received it all. Not only did He not reject her, He honored her. He defended her. He said her story would be told wherever the gospel is preached. Why? Because what others called broken, Jesus called beautiful. What if the parts of you you've been hiding are the very parts He wants to heal? What if your wound is not a wall but a doorway? You don't have to pretend to be strong. You don't have to perform spiritual confidence. You just have to show up with trembling hands, with tear-stained cheeks, with prayers that don't even sound right. God understands the language of a sigh. He interprets your silence. He counts your tears, and He's not distant. He's right here. Even now, I believe His presence is beginning to fill the room where you sit, not to judge, not to demand, but to restore. You are not too much. You are not too far gone. You are not beyond repair. Say this with me now, or write it as a declaration of honesty and hope. God, I bring you every broken piece. I trust you can rebuild me. Everything that is planted with faith blooms in its own time. Do not underestimate the seed this part of the video just planted in your soul. He's not asking for perfection. He's asking for permission to enter the places you've shut off even from yourself, to breathe life again, to make the broken places whole, not in your timing, but in His healing process. And as He begins to do that, we'll step into something deeper in the next key. Because healing is beautiful, but it also brings confrontation. And sometimes the next layer God touches is the one you thought you had buried for good. So the next key will guide us through the power of forgiveness, not just receiving it, but offering it. Even when it hurts, even when they didn't say sorry, even when it feels unfair, we go there next. Key 12. Forgiveness sets you free, even if they're not sorry. Some wounds don't bleed. They just stay. You move on, but it still hurts. You smile, but something inside you tightens when you remember. The offense, the betrayal, the silence that followed. And maybe the hardest part, they never said sorry. Maybe they never even acknowledged the damage. So the question remains, buried beneath your healing attempts. Do I really have to forgive them? That's where the 12th key unlocks something sacred. Forgiveness sets you free, even if they're not sorry. Not because they deserve it, not because you feel like it, but because your soul was never meant to carry that kind of weight. Unforgiveness doesn't just tie you to the past, it chains your future. It wraps itself around your thoughts, your relationships, your worship. It clouds how you see yourself, how you see others, even how you see God. But forgiveness? Forgiveness is a spiritual revolution that begins in silence. It's when you choose freedom over resentment, obedience over justice, healing over hatred. It's not excusing the pain. It's not denying what happened. It's handing the pain to the only one who can truly handle it. Jesus knows this deeply. On the cross, hanging between heaven and earth, surrounded by mockers and executioners, he whispered the most powerful words ever spoken. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He didn't wait for their apology. He didn't condition his mercy on their repentance. He forgave, because forgiveness was the mission. And if you belong to him, it's part of yours too. But let's be honest. Forgiveness can feel like betrayal of your own pain, like you're letting them off the hook, like justice will never come. But that's a lie, because forgiveness is not the end of justice. It's the beginning of surrendered justice. It's saying, "God, I trust you to handle this better than I ever could." Maybe today you're being invited into that surrender. Maybe the next level of freedom you've been praying for won't come through another breakthrough, but through this quiet act of obedience. Even if they never apologize, even if they continue on unaware, you can release them. Because it's not really about them. It's about your soul. Forgiveness doesn't mean re-entry into toxic places. It doesn't mean forgetting. It means releasing the right to revenge. It means saying, "This no longer controls my peace." Let that be your declaration today. Say it with your heart, or write it here, where others can find the courage too. Today, I choose to forgive. I trust God with what hurt me. Tell your soul, I am not a prisoner of the past. I am walking out of this wound with grace. Because when you forgive, heaven moves. Not because you made it easy, but because you made it holy. The pain you release becomes space for peace to take root. And as that healing begins to move through you, the next key will unlock something deeper still. The ability to dream again, to believe in joy again, to open your heart, not just to survive, but to live fully, freely, and expectantly. We'll step into that next. Key 13. God restores the courage to dream again. Somewhere along the way, something inside you stopped expecting. You used to dream. You used to imagine. You used to pray bold prayers and believe they could happen. But now you're just trying to make it through the day. You say the right things. You smile when you're supposed to. But deep down, there's a quiet numbness, a silent conclusion. Maybe I'm not meant for more. But hear me now. Let this truth press gently and urgently into your spirit. God has not finished writing your story. That's the 13th key. God restores the courage to dream again. Not just someday. Not just when everything feels better. Now, even from this place. The pain didn't cancel the promise. The delay didn't erase the possibility. The silence didn't mean you're disqualified. You're still breathing. That means it's not over. The dream may have died, but God resurrects. In Ezekiel 37, God leads the prophet into a valley of dry bones. Lifeless, bleached by time, forgotten by all. And he asked the question, "Son of man, can these bones live?" It wasn't a question of power. It was a question of hope. Because sometimes, the real miracle isn't what God does around us. It's what he resurrects within us. And maybe that's what he's asking you today. Daughter, can your dream live again? Son, do you still believe it's possible? He's not waiting for you to figure out how. He's asking you to speak life into what you buried, just like Ezekiel did. And as he prophesied, the bones rattled, structure returned, flesh appeared. But breath came only when he obeyed God and spoke again. It's time to speak again. It's time to believe that God doesn't just heal what's broken. He breathes on what's dead. Maybe you used to dream of ministry, of a restored family, of a business built in integrity, of writing, teaching, building, loving again. Whatever it was, whatever you gave up on, if God planted it, it's not gone. It's waiting for your yes, for your breath, for your faith to awaken it again. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. So today, begin again. Even with trembling hands, write it down. Whisper it in your room, or type it boldly below, where faith is finding voice again. God, I believe you can resurrect my dream. You perceive how each key is like a piece falling into place. There is a work being completed within you, and it is not random. What you lost in the fire, God is restoring in the quiet. And when it comes, you won't just dream it, you'll live it, with deeper roots and purer joy. But first, there's one more key you need to receive before the final moments. Because even after the dream is reborn, the enemy often comes, not to steal the vision, but to confuse the identity behind it. And that's why the next key speaks not to what you do, but who you are in God's eyes. Let's unlock that together next. Key 14. Your identity in Christ is greater than the labels life gave you. Sometimes the loudest prison isn't built with walls. It's made of words. Words spoken over you. Names you never chose. Labels that stuck to your soul like scars. Failure. Too much. Not enough. Unworthy. Maybe someone called you broken. Maybe they defined you by your past. Maybe the world looked at your scars and decided that's all you would ever be. And over time, without realizing it, you started to believe them. But I need to tell you something now, and I pray it breaks something open inside you. You are not who life labeled you. You are who heaven named you. That's the 14th key. Your identity in Christ is greater than the labels life gave you. Before anyone had the chance to define you, God already did. Before the world saw your weakness, God declared your worth. And He didn't call you by your failures, He called you by name. Isaiah 43:1 says it clearly. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Not, you were mine when you were stronger. Not, you're mine if you get it all together. You are mine. Right here, right now. Think of Jacob, a man who spent much of his life running from truth, running from pain, running from who he was. And yet one night, alone and afraid, he wrestled with God. He held on, bruised and desperate, and said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And God didn't just bless him, He renamed him. You will no longer be called Jacob, He said, but Israel. Jacob, the deceiver, became Israel, the one who wrestles with God and prevails. God didn't just give him a new future, He gave him a new identity. And maybe that's what He's doing in you. Maybe the wrestling you've endured wasn't to break you, but to rename you. You're not your mistakes. You're not the betrayal you experienced. You're not the diagnosis. You're not the absence of applause or the weight of expectation. You are chosen. You are loved. You are seen. You are redeemed. You are His. So today, let this be a holy moment of renaming. If you've lived under a label that was never yours, bring it to the altar. Tear it off. Write a new one. Say it now, or declare it below where others are stepping into their names again. I am who God says I am. I belong to Him. Have you lived something similar to what was revealed today? Share it. Your story might be the bridge for someone else to find healing. Because when you begin to walk in your real identity, everything shifts. Your prayers sound different. Your choices align with truth. Your joy returns, not because life got easier, but because you remembered who you are. You're not invisible. You're not forgotten. You are engraved on the palms of His hands. And as we prepare for the final key in this sacred journey, one truth remains. Everything we've walked through, every pain, every promise, every pause, has led to this moment. Because the last key is not just something to carry, it's something to become. Let's go there together. Key 15. Total surrender unlocks the fullness of God's plan. There comes a moment, quiet and holy, when you stop asking for answers and start offering your whole heart. Not because you figured it all out, not because the pain disappeared, but because you finally realized, I'd rather walk with God into the unknown than walk alone into what seems safe. That's the 15th key. Total surrender unlocks the fullness of God's plan. Not partial obedience, not delayed trust, but total, trembling, vulnerable surrender. It's the moment you let go, not because you gave up, but because you gave it to Him. You stop striving, you stop bargaining, you stop waiting to feel ready, and you simply say, God, I am yours. Whatever you want, I trust you. Surrender is not weakness. It is the gateway to the supernatural. It is what turns an ordinary life into a divine story. It is what unlocks the doors that effort could never open. Think of Mary, a teenage girl visited by an angel, told she would carry the Son of God. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't delay. She simply whispered, "Let it be done to me according to your word." And with that surrender, history changed. Or think of Jesus, Gethsemane, sweat like blood, anguish in every breath. He didn't pretend it was easy. He didn't skip the pain, but he surrendered. "Not my will, but yours be done." And through that surrender, salvation was born. Maybe today is your Gethsemane moment. Maybe you've come through the pain, through the silence, through the waiting, the forgiving, the rebuilding. And now, at the edge of something new, you hear a whisper. Will you trust me completely? God is not asking you to perform. He's asking you to release. Because what he has planned for you doesn't require perfection, just availability. So here's the invitation. Lay it down. The fear, the timeline, the old identity, the backup plan. And open your hands to whatever God has next. Say it out loud, or write it as a prayer that marks this holy moment. God, I surrender everything. I want your plan, not mine. If you've made it this far, it's not by accident. You've stayed through every key, every silence, every healing, and that means something. You're not just watching a video. You're walking through a threshold. You're stepping into a new season, one marked by surrender and sustained by his presence. So don't leave this space lightly. Let this be the day where something shifts permanently. Let your soul breathe again. If this journey touched you deeply, consider staying close. This community isn't just content, it's communion. We're walking this road together, and there's room for you. Thank you for staying until the end. If you're still here, something in your heart answered the call, and that matters, more than you know. There are seeds of eternity planted in every soul that stays through the fire and finishes with surrender. And if you feel led, write this final declaration in the comments. Let it be your seal. My heart is ready for God's plan. I surrender all. And now, as this message ends, your journey continues. Other words are waiting for you. Divine reminders of who you are, where you're going, and who walks beside you. If the Spirit spoke today, perhaps the next word is already waiting for you in the video beside this one. Remember, the faith born here does not end here. It walks with you, it breathes with you, and it will carry you into everything God promised. Go now, surrendered, and never alone. Thank you. From the deepest place in my heart, thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing this message to touch your spirit. This wasn't just a video. It was a sacred journey we walked together. Every moment you remained here, you were saying yes to something greater, to healing, to hope, to heaven's voice calling you deeper. So whether you whispered a prayer or simply let the silence sink in, know this: you are seen, you are loved, and you are part of something holy. If this message spoke to you, don't let it end here. Stay close. There's more truth, more presence, more of God's heart waiting to meet you in the next breath. From this small corner of faith, I bless your journey forward, and I thank you for making this one unforgettable. Until next time, walk in faith, rest in grace, and never forget, God is not finished with you.